Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. Yes, with half an hour to play with, I felt that I had to take out a chapter or two out of the recent study. And of course, this isn't really particularly new. I'm going to be talking about things that go all the way back to the 1970s. So forgive me for not being always current, but the arguments I think are very current and come out of other things going on as well. And what I wanted to look at is this important transition, the word most commonly used for it, into late antiquity. We know that the early Roman period and the late Roman periods are very different. I mean, there's change all the way through, but there's a marked gear change. And a lot of attention has been given to this issue by ancient historians and economic historians. I think a little bit less by archaeologists, because we are often slightly afraid of the historical background to it, in the sense that our data isn't usually able to give us sufficiently precise dates to talk about the close history that marks this change. But I start out with this quote from the Cambridge Economic History, and it's Marcus Aurelius from the Capitoline Museum on our left there. And it is Marcus Aurelius and these events between the mid-2nd century and the late 3rd century that I'm going to be giving my attention to. And in particular, if you look at the quote up there, which I won't read in full, it is to look at this balance between what we see changing in the Roman world and some of the factors that may both provoke change and account for the detail of that change. And the particular word that I lifted from that quote is plagues and wars, and we'll be getting a little bit of both. But we'll also be getting quite a lot of archaeology. And this is where I have to make sure I've now worked out how to press the forward button. There we go. Yes, there we go. Too fast. Beg your apologies. So if we look at the earlier Roman city, which is not the subject of my attention now, this is one of very rapid growth of a very busy city. It's one that is providing a lot of the supplies and goods that are helping the army in its forward campaigns during the early period, and which is sustaining the Romanized lifestyles required by the administration. And London is therefore very much a port city, and the work of Gustav Milne and Trevor Brigham and others along the London's waterfront have provided us with this wealth of information about the growth of the city and how it is serving as this logistical hub. And this is still one of my favorite pictures of Roman London. It's the model that used to sit in the Museum of London. And I always show this slide of that model because I really, really hope that that model is resurrected and finds a home when the museum completes its move, because this is just so good on the detail. It brings together Gustav and other people's work so wonderfully. So this is a very busy, successful city, and colleagues have estimated rising to a population 20, 30,000, probably over 30,000 at its Hadrianic peak. And again, I'm sorry, I'm struggling. There we go. It is also common knowledge amongst those who dig in the city that the later Roman city is a much harder beast to grapple with. We have much less archaeological visibility. And this goes back now a century's worth of archaeological research concluded that this absence of late antique stratigraphy might have suggested a city that had declined from its Hadrianic peak, and I think we'll conclude today by saying it did so decline. And there the quote from Quintin Waddington going back to 1930, that London may have diminished very rapidly in size. And of course, black and white slides. This is going back to my entry into London's archaeology in the mid-1970s. And the issue here for digging archaeologists has been one of trying to make sense of dark earth. It occupied an awful lot of attention in the 1980s and 1990s. The work of Richard MacPhail and others fairly conclusively drawing us to the conclusion that this was a process of formation, a soil that had been accreted by addition of rubbish, but in particular had involved activities that would erode into the underlying stratigraphy. And it was Brian Newell in 1990 in a paper in Antiquity who drew our attention to the way in which these erosive processes would actually have damaged and eaten into the earlier Roman archaeology. And this leads to it's kind of it's the dark earth etchmai stratigraphy excuse one gives to the teacher as to why we don't have late antique London. An oversimplification, of course. But the key issue here is that activity, those activities, root action and worm action, can have damaged some of our late antique deposits. And this has caused a lot of caution about how to read these changes. If we are not sure that absence of evidence is evidence of absence, how far do we go in drawing conclusions from the diminished nature of the late antique archaeology? And I take you back now to the very first site actually dug in London for Steve Roscombe's at Newgate Street, where I joined his team briefly to get to grips with Museum of London recording systems. And we were excavating the sorts of features you see on the left there, black and white, because it does go back into the 1970s. But the stratigraphy we had actually been eaten into through bioturbation. We had late floors in strip buildings, in workshops that were eroded in part by such activities. But we also had our areas of subsidence, and substance seems to have been a bit of a theme today, of the things that drop into pits through poorly consolidated fills. And in those areas of substance, we were able to identify areas of stratigraphy that appeared to have escaped the worst effects of bioturbation. And they showed that our Antonine buildings, our mid-2nd century buildings, had actually been at some point demolished, and the building materials from those structures had not been recycled. And that was the earlier pattern of structural activity, was recycling and reuse of what was going on. So we had a situation of apparently an end in our structural sequences, and that's supported by the fact that they weren't digging new drains, foundations weren't being dug into deeper levels, areas which would have escaped bioturbation. And in particular, these tile ovens, if you look at on the left, well, they're sufficiently robust to escape the action of roots and worms. And the fact that we had a full sequence of such tile ovens through the Flavian and early 2nd century sequences, and then they ceased to be replaced and built anew, marks an end of the stratigraphic sequence. So we emerged from the work on these sorts of sites, I think, with a renewed degree of confidence that these changes we're seeing in the 2nd century are to a certain extent real, and that abandonment is going on, and dark earth formation, which definitely is a product of these areas being open areas, open to the activities of roots and worms, that dark earth formation was a late 2nd century phenomenon in many parts of London, not necessarily, or it's also a post-Roman feature as well. And I won't go into detail because time is going to press, but there are various other signals going on from the archaeology of the London region showing that there is a sharp transition from a busy rebuild, renew city to one with less activity going on. And the key slide there, based on Robin Simmons's work and the Museum of London's databases, is how there is a sharp fall off in the number of pottery assemblages in the 150s into the 160s. And at that point, we see a much diminished level of pottery assemblages coming from a database of all excavated material in London. And I won't drill into some of the other detail there on the right, but just to say we have other activities going on to suggest that there was indeed a significant paradigm shift in scale. London is to some extent seeing areas of built land become open land, become redundant. And that contraction of settlement density, not size, but density, that contraction of settlement density isn't the product of people fleeing London to the countryside or moving out of the countryside, because where we are looking at densities of rural settlement, they also do seem to show a peak in that early 2nd century period. Here, the data from the Rural Settlement of Britain project, where obviously the chronologies are much harder to pin down. Rural sites are generating less depth of stratigraphy, less material. We can pin things down to precise dates. But the roadside settlements around London also seem to be showing some areas of interruption to settlement in the late 2nd century. In the book that Harvey very kindly gave a quick puff for us, he introduced me, I've tried to plot those sites where we don't have basements truncating sequences, where we don't have a loss of stratigraphic sequence, but we can actually trace what is going on through the course of the 2nd century. And I identified 116 sites of domestic architecture rather than looking at public buildings, where we seemed to have the ability to chart what was going on through the course of the 2nd century. And from that, I estimate that nearly 60% of those sites had actually seen some or indeed significant contraction in the 2nd century. But on this, by the same token, some sites show continuity, and this map shows that those sites of continuity are clustered a little bit along the waterfront, a little bit in areas of natural water supply in the Walbrook Valley, and such locations. So there are buildings which carry on in use, and by taking those crude statistics, the decline could be argued to see London return in scale of population to roughly where it had been in the Neronian period prior to its Flavian enlargement. The busy Hadrianic city is seeing population perhaps being reduced to earlier levels. So not an abandonment of London, not something that's wiped the city out, but a significant contraction. And there we go. One of the glorious things about studying the archaeology of the City of London is the product of all of our dendrochronology. And the work of Damien Goodburn on how timbers are used shows that most of the timber being supplied to London was being felled for purpose. It was used green, it wasn't stockpiled. And so when we get dendrochronological dates, there's a good chance that those dates are giving us the dates of when structures are put up. And even if they're not, the very felling date of those timbers is a mark of a procurement exercise. Someone is going out there, marking trees up for felling and bringing that timber to London. And this is a major exercise. And so when we're trying to date what's going on in the 2nd century, we can actually look at the fact that during the 150s, London sees brisk and busy structural activity. And there's a list there of some of the dendro-dated major engineering products of the 150s and 160s. And that sequence of build, put new things up, work on waterfronts, does seem to come to an end in the early 160s. By 165, we've got some dendrochronology dates from Millennium Bridge, from a portico, dug by PCA Archaeology. And that AD 165 dendro date is the last in a series of construction activities that then gives way to a period where fewer structures are going up. And because we've got thousands of dendro dates now from London, thousands of tree ring dated structures, that shift in busy to reduced, it appears to be a real phenomenon. And we've got just the one timber frame building at St Mary Hill from the 15 years after 165. Try to explain that change. We've identified that there perhaps is a significant level of change. We've identified that the likely date for that change is parked in the middle of the 160s. And we have other things going on in terms of cessation of certain potteries being in operation, from some glass kilns not being replaced, from port activity perhaps being diminished, and our timber procurement we've just identified sees a slump. And these are features that would suggest that the shrinkage of density of population is also seeing perhaps manpower shortages kicking in to affect these other aspects of the urban economy. And one potential cause might be the relocation of the garrison in the Hadrianic fort at Cripplegate, but itself is perhaps not sufficient to account for the scale of change. And it's lovely that I've been introduced by Harvey, because of course Harvey was first with this, as with so many things, of identifying one of the potential causes of change being the Antonine Plague that we know to have affected the Roman world in the middle of the 2nd century. Discussing plague is terribly difficult for archaeologists because we can't actually count the people involved. We're looking at an era where cremation is still the predominant burial rite, so we're not in a situation to say that the absence of, we can't find dead people. We can't show that the city is contracting because of plague. And there are plenty of other things going on in the 160s that we also need to look to as potential causes for London going through a contraction of some sort. Economic recession, warfare, political disruptions are all of them potential causes. But Harvey identified the Antonine Plague as one of them, and more recent research is suggesting that that is perhaps the place we should be looking. I have a visual aid here. and this is the book by Kyle Harper, The Fate of Rome. And this is a splendid survey of the impact of pandemics on the Roman world. And of course, with COVID-19 drawing our attention to the social and economic impact of pandemic, it is very fit to return to the issue of the extent to which the Antonine Plague may have been a major feature in the changes of the 2nd century. It's documented in AD 165 in Asia Minor. It's argued to be brought back from the Parthian Wars, but that's not necessarily a given. But we've got mass mortalities occurring, described by ancient sources, as summarized by Kyle Harper, from Rome in 166, and then on elsewhere in the Roman world. And the Greek physician Galen, who provides us with historical descriptions of the disease, gives information which suggests it might have been smallpox. This is not a certainty. It's never been identified through scientific research, but the descriptions of how people were dying seems consistent with smallpox. And if so, and if this were Europe's first encounter with smallpox, we have the lessons drawn from smallpox viral impact elsewhere, obviously South America and such like, to suggest very high levels of mortality. And this is consistent with some of the change we see going on. The extent to which the Antonine Plague was a game changer in the Roman world divides people. There are very different levels of argument about its impact on the Roman economy. There are very different arguments about its impact on population levels. We don't have the precise data to work with. But what we do have is a major plague event, and the date of circa AD 165, 166 is very consistent with what we see as the likely date for major change in London as well. And we do have other proxy evidence to suggest that certainly fear of plague, if not the plague itself, did have an impact on Britain. The map you that show there shows yellow dots of proxy indicators of the Antonine Plague. And the key there is this absolutely awesome discovery at Vintry. It's now well published. Roger Tomlin's provided the major translation of it. And this is a magic charm, a rolled up pewter strip on which was inscribed a charm that had been rolled up to be carried in an amulet. And the text here uses words, Phoebus of the unshorn hair, that's another term for Apollo, archer, drive away the cloud of plague. And that wording is almost bang on to an oracle issued by this figure you see at the bottom left of the slide. This is the snake god Glycon, a descendant of Asclepius. Lucian, who writes about the fake prophet Alexander, based on the Black Sea at Abontekius, because of course this is the fake oracle. All the others are obviously we can trust and believe in, but this is the fake oracle of Glycon, this snake who talked to Alexander with his splendid wig, and this is a statue from Tomis from Romania on the Black Sea. So we know that someone in London, and the pewter is probably a British pewter, someone in London was sufficiently afraid of the Antonine Plague to be carrying this spell. And Rafe Merrifield, and I've forgotten the exact date of this, but I think we're in the 1980s now, Rafe Merrifield produced a splendid paper looking at a 2nd century archer god cult that we seem to have in London, in that we've got 3 major depictions of an archer god, and Rafe identified this as being potentially Apollo, and of course Apollo with his bow being the bringer of plague and healing. And notice the curly locks of the statue from Bevis Marks on the left there. This is our unshorn Phoebus, Apollo the archer. And we know that the erection of these altars and statues to Apollo was a prophylactic against the plague. The Oracle of Claros, another of these Asia Minor oracles, closely connected with that at Abontekius, recommended that such statues should be built. And indeed, we have a dedication to such from Housteads. So we know that the fear of this, we don't know, but we have quite a lot of proxy evidence which would appear to indicate that fear of the Antonine Plague was a sufficient big deal in Britain in the 160s. Oop. And this is where I'm going to run out of time, as Mike did before us. London does rebound successfully after plague, but it's a generation later. The port is rebuilt, city walls are rebuilt, built. So we know that London picks itself back up from plague. But we then have another major event in the 3rd century. The archaeology of this is identified from the work that Trevor Brigham in particular did on London's later Roman waterfront. And he identified the way in which the timber quays that had been providing a platform for shipments of Samian into the 3rd century were chopped back to make a crude defensive bank. At the same time, we have amphora imports reduced massively, and we have other regional interruptions to economic production, in particular in the Weald and ironworking. So we have, and I won't call it a repeat exercise, but we do seem to have something else going on in the 3rd century that is also seeing London change in its direction and structure. And here too, we benefit from the amazing quality of archaeological dating from London. We know that London's quays were still importing fresh imports of Samian, which got thrown onto the waterfront into probably the 240s. We have waterfront engineering going on. There's warehouses and waterfronts being built in Southwark. So the city is still thriving as a port into the 240s. And our last major import of timber comes in AD 252-3, which is when we see road engineering at 1 Poultry. And just as previously, we have these busy activities going on, and then we have a gap. And there's virtually nothing coming out of structural activity suggesting that timbers are being imported to London in the 260s and 270s. Well, into the early 270s, until the construction of London's Riverside Wall, probably in the early 270s. And there are other traces of evidence suggesting that forestry management, woodland management, is going through a period of less intense activity in the 260s. And we're back in the same area if we date the big changes in London to the 250s. We are once again in a period of known plague. There are other issues that we have to take into consideration. We know that tidal regression may have made London's port harder to use. We also have frontier instability. We have the breakaway Gallic Empire, which would have disrupted contacts with the Mediterranean world. So there are a variety of other things going on. But London's chronology fits very well with what is known as the Plague of Cyprian, as described by St. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, who's shown from the Ravenna mosaics there on the right-hand side. And the Plague of Cyprian, which Karl Harper also describes in his splendid book, is seen as having had a likely impact on manpower levels in late antiquity. Very quickly, just to say, why was the waterfront dismantled and replaced by a defensive bank? Well, Frankish piracy is a potential interest here. The coin issues there of Postumus of the Gallic Empire is Neptuni Reduce is the concern with some form of naval success, not necessarily piracy, but potentially. And we know that Carausius was appointed later in the 3rd century to his command in Britain before he usurped because of the need to suppress seaborne raiders. So this is a situation where it's not about London's defences being grand town walls designed to impress people, but potentially a defensive barrier against piracy. And of course, piracy, if it is on the rise, is potentially a product of manpower losses and reductions in the period. And once again, London is restored. I've given myself too little time to talk about the restoration of London, but it comes back, but it's still as a diminished site, as a centre for political authority, rather than the big port city it had been beforehand. London is no longer a place of major transshipment. The troops based in Britain are expected to look more locally to their supplies. So I've run out of time, really. I'll leave my concluding thoughts on the screen, just as they're there. You can read the book where they're described in greater detail, or you can look at this PowerPoint presentation later on. But I do think that there is a significant chance that these pandemic events are contributory to the dislocation of London in these two key dates, which our dendro dates seem to suggest coincide with plagues. I'll stop there, and I apologize if I'm trying to squeeze too much in. I always do.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Dom. Sorry. Thank you very much indeed. Jane, do you have any questions for Dom at all?
Not as yet.
Okay,
I think everyone is completely overwhelmed by the huge amounts of fascinating data. I quite like the piracy. Ending on a day with pirates is great.
Okay. Well, I mean, yes, as I think one of the factors that is inherent in what Dominic has written essentially is that, sorry, let me put my video on, essentially is that that he's provided for us a massive amount of evidence which ought to create the sort of fresh debates that are required about London. And of course, what Dominic's drawn on is not only the earlier work, such as done by Rafe Merrifield, but he's also been able to look at a lot of the results of this excavations on a much bigger scale. I mean, particularly since well, I suppose the 1980s and beyond, and again rising with the changes to the essentially the government provision in the from about 1990, which puts archaeology central to planning decisions. And there is a vast amount of data, some of it at the time, like the dendro dates, which are very difficult to argue with. I mean, they are providing fresh sets of information, as are, of course, the written information too. I mean, it was one of the great results of the Mithras site excavation, the fresh part that was looked at 10 years ago, was a number of writing tablets. Of course, the fright was of how many writing tablets must have been destroyed after Grimes's excavation on the site, when archaeologists weren't allowed there while the whole of that rest of that development was done. Because I think the truth of the matter is we get an awful lot more information out of writing than we do out of pottery, with all due respect to pottery. But Dom, I think clearly looking at these things is very important, and it was very, very interesting how the periods of these potential plagues, whatever they were, pandemics, maybe we should call them rather than plagues, did seem to relate to times when there was so little being done in the way of the dendro evidence revealing new or refurbished buildings. There must be periods of ups and downs, I'm sure. Go on, yes, please.
Yeah, I just think that this is really a testament to the work that's gone on in city archaeology and Southwark archaeology. The amazing wealth of material we've got out of London means that this is centre stage as a source of information for studying these changes. And dendrochronology, but related to structures, related to buildings, related to waterfronts, has added to the sum of human knowledge in an amazing way. And I am just so proud to have been part of a community, because this is the work of thousands of people. This is the work, and Harvey, you know, we are in your debt because you laid so much of the groundwork for the creation of this attention to London's archaeology. And I really loved writing a book about this because it was celebrating the work of so many people I admire. And all I've done is coast on the back of other people's work and thrown in some contentious arguments on top.
Well, kind of you to say it. I've done a lot of coasting on other people's work as well. So. But Dom, it's a great way of ending the conference this afternoon. And all I'd like to add, if I may, Dom, is to it is I haven't said anything about membership of LAMUS, but I would urge people in the audience who are not members and who want to support LAMUS in the fights we have to have when things like, well, essentially the laws about planning might change and again badly affect us, looking at the Johnson proposals, which have resurfaced again in another form. You know, it's an old cliche of mine, but our membership is our strength. So those of you who do want to help support archaeology, please consider, and you're not members of LAMUS, if you are, please consider joining us. An individual subscription is £20 for a year. And I have the authority to say that if anyone does join us as a result of coming to this conference, or indeed even hearing about it, Lammas will make you a present of an earlier example of transactions, not the current one, but we will provide you with what will be a volume from our reports, really, of London's archaeology and history. So yeah, do please consider joining us. That will also give you, of course, access to our lecture series and all our other activities like Jane's Lammas Lates, and then you'll be supporting a very good cause. You can get the details, of course, off the website. So please do get in touch with us if you're not a member and wish to join. But I'd like to thank you, whether members or non-members. Thank you all for coming here today. Thanks to all the speakers, both this morning and this afternoon, for producing these talks, which is been very good for us all to listen to. And Glenda, I'd like just to thank you, if I may, for making sure that we got things through. Okay, and to Jane, of course, too, who's taken a lot of the strain in the middle ground. So I think probably, Jane, unless there's anything else you think I should say, we can close it there.
No, I think that's fine. Encouraging people to join, telling them that they get a free copy of the journal, advertising the lates. Don't forget we have 2 more lectures, folks, in our lecture series coming up April and May, including our joint prehistoric society. But no, I think that happily concludes the business. We have noted the issues about sound, and we have noted the desire for face-to-face meeting up. We will look into venues for hybrid conference next year, so people that do want to stay at home in their pajamas can do, whilst those that want to join and chat and discuss and debate, and I think having a pint was mentioned, so we will look into all that. Any suggestions for venues, and I've had 2 already, please do let us know via the usual sources. Okay, well, thanks very much, Jane, and thanks to all of you who've taken part in this, all the speakers who've done such a wonderful job this morning and this afternoon. Okay, so we say goodbye and nice to see you all.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Enjoy.